So Lavrentiy Beria was the head of the NKVD, which was the predecessor to the much more famous KGB. And at the end of World War II, at the Yalta Conference, Roosevelt was introduced by Stalin to this gentleman, and he was introduced as being our Himmler. So, for those who don't know, Himmler was in charge of the SS, so he oversaw the death camps and the concentration camps within Nazi Germany. So, considering they were in the middle of a war still, like the war wasn't over just yet, and this authoritarian dictator had introduced his right hand man as being our Himmler. Yeah, it kind of shows just how murderous the Stalinist regime was. And this, of course, is no accident at all, because Lavrentiy Beria was in many ways, you could possibly argue, even a worse version of Himmler than Himmler. And the reason for that is because he oversaw an empire of misery, of slavery, and of mass murder. Yeah, from west to east, yeah, across the whole of the USSR, primarily in the frozen tundra of Siberia. Political prisoners, anyone suspected of being against the state or criticizing Stalin at all, was sent to these gulags and had to do back-breaking labor in the freezing tundra, and yeah, obviously many of them died. And on top of that, he oversaw many purges that took place. And as a matter of fact, Lavrentiy Beria himself got the job as a result of there being a purge of his predecessor. So Yezhov was in charge of the NKVD before Beria. Beria was his deputy, and Yezhov was in the middle of overseeing the purges, which went from 1936 to 1938. And so he rounded up loads of people within the party, like top generals, etc., purged them all, executed them, etc. And what ended up then happening to Yezhov is that Stalin was then suspicious of him, and then in turn the purger was himself purged, and as a result, this is how Beria ended up getting the job. So because of this, Beria understood that in a way his power was always beholden to what Stalin wanted, and so he did everything he could to please Stalin without ever kind of like stepping on his toes as such. And the level of paranoia that there was in the Soviet Union meant that you really didn't want to be stepping on Stalin's toes. And actually, the film The Death of Stalin, so definitely watch that. That film kind of really watch that, because that gives you, I know it's done in a very comical way, but many of the more serious angles to that will give you a really good insight into this era and into the different characters who are involved here. However, Stalin died in 1953, and what ended up happening then was a power struggle, because in the Soviet Union there was no clear line of succession, and so there was a competition between Malenkov, Khrushchev, and Beria. And Beria, being the head of the NKVD, had in many ways the apparatus to kind of like to take power if he wanted to, and this was attempted. And what ended up then happening is, in the midst of this power struggle, Nikita Khrushchev, who was kind of seen as a bit of a joke in all fairness, he ended up maneuvering his way right to the top, and he ended up becoming the new leader of the USSR. And as we know from studying the Cold War, Khrushchev, a few years later, led the de-Stalinization campaign, and so as a result, we tend to think of Khrushchev as being the more like liberal kind of reformer, and obviously we see people like Beria as being, obviously very much in Stalin's camp. And so the assumption has always been that Khrushchev was the better person to have taken over after Stalin. However, when we look into it, we kind of find a bit of a juxtaposition with regard to Beria, because while he was working for Stalin, he was a very, very notorious person, and we'll get onto some of his exploits in a bit. But what we have to understand is that what he wanted to do when he ended up getting to the high office himself was very different from what Khrushchev wanted. And we'll get into this in a little bit, but it was much better in many ways than what Khrushchev wanted. So just to give you a bit of an insight in this, Beria was not a nice person. Just need to say this, he's a mass murderer, he was a mass torturer, and he was a prolific rapist as well. Yeah, you know, like many of the wives and girlfriends of his captors, you know, like he would like rape them and be like, oh yeah, like, oh, I might release your husband, and obviously he didn't, but he would kind of just use that. And he was even like known to like drive around like the neighborhoods and stuff and just pick up random women and just say, look, you know, something along the lines of, there's no point in you like protesting, there's no point in you screaming, like I have all the power in this situation, so like just act accordingly basically. So yeah, so obviously not a nice man at all, just really want to say this. However, there's obviously the interpersonal and then there's the political in terms of how people are in their day-to-day lives, and the crimes that they commit on day-to-day lives is different from how they might have governed if they'd been at the top. So let's just take on face value what Beria himself wanted.